Part of the problem is that they don't care about canon. It seems like a four-letter word for these studios that inherit or, buy these beloved properties, that they do not care to adhere to the lore that was established previously. It's like a hindrance to them. And I'm sorry, this just comes with the territory. If you want the built-in fan base that these beloved IPs provide, that come with, you have to do the work on your end. You have to give them something that lives up to what came before. So their chief creative officer, Dave Filoni, I think that's his current title, although previously he was known as something like deputy chief, basically the same thing, slightly different wording. But this is your chief creative officer, who many were hoping to carry the torch of George Lucas's legacy. But see, this is the problem, and this is the problem I've always had with Filoni, is that he does not care about canon. And I literally just saw this article this morning. Star Wars canon is like jazz, not classical music, explains Lucasfilm's Dave Filoni. When I saw that headline, I'm like, oh boy, what is this? This is an article from Screen Rant. So in summary, canon in Star Wars is like jazz, like free-flowing, ever-changing, and open to individual interpretation. That's my problem. Canon is not open to your interpretation. I know there's some strong episodes throughout the Clone Wars series, but I feel like it really muddied the canon in respects to the really core elements, like the Force, of the light side and dark side, and they introduced time travel, which he says it's not time travel, but it literally is with the World Between Worlds. It just became really convoluted. There are just some things that should be simple. And when it comes to the Force is simple. You have the light side and you have the dark side. The light side being good, the side of compassion, and trying to help others, being a force for good in the galaxy. And you have the dark side, which is primarily used by the Sith, who represent that represents evil and selfishness and the oppression of the innocent. But now you have this thing, and I think maybe it started with the Clone Wars, maybe. I think they may have been sowing the seeds of what was to come under Disney. The heroes were seen as incredibly fallible, and the Jedi had their issues. No one's saying that they were perfect, but as an institution, they were forced for good. Individually, they all still had to struggle to avoid the dark side, to avoid the temptation of making choices that were self-serving, that were out of anger and fear and doubt and hate. Some failed, some faltered, some turned back to the light before it was too late. But as we saw with ones like Dooku and Anakin, obviously, that chronicled his whole fall to the dark side as Darth Vader. That's what happens. When you fall, when you are consumed by the dark side, you are no longer that force for good. It just feels like these are like simple elements, core themes of George Lucas's Star Wars that I feel they've been slowly trying to muddle. And I feel like the Acolyte represents the biggest push for them to say that there's no right and wrong. It just depends on what side you're on. It just depends on your point of view. Moral relativism. And it's not like that stuff hasn't been done before. It has. But I've seen it done in a far more compelling way, in a far more compelling and intelligent way. But when it comes to Star Wars, this is Star Wars. This is the battle of good versus evil. Okay, so Filoni has said this before. I remember Sam Witwer actually commenting on this in some sort of podcast. I can't remember exactly what he was on, but he was talking about he was voicing his character Darth Maul in a novel, and I think maybe an origin story, a new origin story for Darth Maul or something like that. Anyway, he was doing voice work for that, and he realized that the backstory for Darth Maul or something didn't align with what he had already done on the Clone Wars show, and he asked Filoni about it. And Filoni told him, well, it doesn't matter because it's all tall tales. It's someone else's perspective of this tale. And I'm sorry, that is just so messed up. That is not how it works. With a world-building IP like this, canon is important. Lore is important. It's what makes it entertaining when your universe has these kind of rules in it. It raises the stakes. It makes it more interesting. Nothing matters. Then what are we even doing here? It makes it boring. It makes your universe boring. If you could just change whatever you want on a dime, willy-nilly, then nothing matters. The stakes don't matter. Like the hero's journey just becomes less epic, I guess. Oh, no. Anyway, so they're all just tall tales to him, so it doesn't matter, is basically what he was saying. So this seems to be along those same lines. In this new quote, Screen Rant says it was an interview with the WGAW podcast. Yes, it says, in his view, canon is extremely challenging because every person comes to Star Wars from their own point of view. And he says, quote, I don't sit there honestly and think that my point of view is greater or better than anybody else's. George's point of view should be the guiding light here. He continues, I tend to look at it a little bit like Arthurian tales, to be honest, and how depending on what version you're reading and translation, they can be wildly different. But Arthur is usually Arthur and does the things he's supposed to do. Those things remain true, and that's very much folktale and fairy tale type of ideology. If we tell a story in animation, or if it's in a comic, and then we bring it to the screen in a different way, we might make changes to it out of the medium, out of the bias of the person making it. But it should still maintain the heart and the important moments of what people liked about that story. He literally just says it should contain the bias of the person making it. What are we even doing? What are we even doing? I'm sorry, that's just selfishness to me, which is the path of the dark side. This isn't your story. This isn't your world. Someone else created it, and you're just trying to tell a story within it. So yes, you need to adhere to the rules and the lore elements present in it. And I feel like the EU, I know there are some exceptions. Like there was kind of like this understanding when it came to canon and under the previous George Lucas era that some mediums were given more leeway when it came to canon. And for certain mediums, I can see that not being as big of an issue, like video games, for example. I don't think it was ever considered strict canon, the Force Unleashed games. And that was a pretty big deal. It had, Vader's Secret Apprentice. So that was really cool concept, but I'm not sure if it was ever considered like strict canon. So I think it was a little loose there. Also, I think some comics were maybe given a little bit more leeway. But those are just those kinds of mediums that allow for that kind of flexibility, I guess. But again, they still hearken to the spirit of George Lucas's lore and weren't like trying to dismantle it with their own bias. That's what's happening now. But I think the EU, when it came to the books, they really strived to adhere to the films. The films were always like the strictest canon. And every time I hear, when I read a Star Wars book, and they mention things that happened in the prequel movies and the OT movies, it's correct. I feel like the books and the authors of the books in the EU really tried to do their best to adhere to, especially movies, but the novelists work together too, because they'd have like a run, like the Fate of the Order series or New Jedi Order series. Like they'd all kind of work together and consult on each other to make sure that their works would be coherent and that they would flow together nicely. Unlike the sequel trilogy, where J.J. Abrams did what he wanted and set up all these storylines, and Rian Johnson came along and just threw all that in the trash and just did his own thing. And he's the chief creative officer. Dave Filoni is the chief creative officer. It is your job. That is literally your only job, is to maintain the lore and accuracy of it and across these multimedia productions. I mean, what are you doing then? What is your job as a chief creative officer if you just let anyone do whatever they want? It makes it boring when there's no rules, I guess, to adhere to. If everyone's just doing their own point of view story and putting their own bias, their own spin on it, well, then what are we doing here? And even then, he ends this quote by saying, it should still maintain the heart and the important moments of what people liked about that story. But I don't think you can say that about the Acolyte. So even in that respect, he fails. As chief creative officer, he has failed to adhere to those core elements, the spirit of George Lucas's mythology. So one of the most important things in it that the Acolyte has just kind of dismantled was the prophecy. The chosen one prophecy of Anakin, who was born in conception by the Force. But now we have something that's kind of tearing that up. But again, when you have someone who doesn't care about lore and continuity, this is the result.